T-minus 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Launch Sequence Podcast, episode 73. And I know we did a lot of citizencon talking last week, but there's more to be had. So we talked about all the general topics last time and didn't really dive too much into any one thing. But this week I have brought on Blackmaze and Avenger 1, two prominent names from the community who both do a lot of ship stuff. And because of that, we're going to talk about ship stuff. Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing? Not all at once.
I was being humble. Thank you, Space. It's great to be back. We talked before, and I really enjoyed that. So it's awesome to be back, and it's a great opportunity to meet Avenger. I haven't met him yet, so that's awesome.
Yeah.
Likewise, yeah. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk to Blackmaze and make his acquaintance, all that stuff, and mostly talk about flight stuff.
Well, as Blackmaze mentioned, both of you have been on this podcast before, and we've talked about either side of what you two specialize in, Blackmaze being more of a racer and Avenger 1 being a pew-pew type. Now, this conversation is going to center around the combat and speed changes that we were introduced to during citizencon and are likely coming sometime soon, TM. I'm personally more of a fan of like the quantum changes and the complications and like questions surrounding that, but I know most of this conversation centers on these SCM changes and the restrictions or lack thereof they might have. So why don't we get a kind of a basic overview of what these changes are on the SCM side of things? Either of you go ahead and take a first stab at it.
Go ahead, Black. I'll listen to you, buddy.
All right, no worries. First, there's one thing I gotta mention, and this is so important, right? Star Citizen offers flight for many different people. You know, there's the combat, there's racing, there's exploration, mining. There's so much to it, and I'm not just a racer, right? I definitely like going fast, but it's really important to mention that Star Citizen flight, the flight experience in general, I love all aspects of it, and it's very special what we have right now. And so whenever CIG decides to touch it, they're touching something very precious. I do get told a lot, like, yeah, but you're just looking at it from a racer perspective. And I just want to say up front, that's not true. I try to look at it broadly. And I think I probably do more chilled out roaming around planets than I do racing, in my spare time. So,
and to that point, while we be looking at your guys' own personal views of this in terms of what you do mostly, I also definitely want to make sure we're talking about it from the perspective of a trader or I don't know, some scumbag out there who's just kind of skipping around, beating up on people. I want to see all of the perspectives on it because I know you guys both do things other than that stuff.
For sure. So yeah, right now we have a model that is very free. Let's say if you are in space, especially if you're flying decoupled, you can push the throttle and you will reach 1,200 or for some ships even 1,300 meters per second. Whatever your acceleration provides decides how long it takes for you to reach that point. You can keep floating. And, there are some speed limits because of technical reasons. You don't want ships going 5,000 meters per second because that would break a lot of things. But that's the really cool thing about what we have right now. You've got your right stick for your rotationals, and it's all very free. And it's up to the pilot to avoid becoming catch up on some space station. It's very easy to go too fast, especially in space. And that's what makes it so cool, the contrast between space and, a dense atmosphere where it's a lot harder to go fast because the atmosphere kind of functions as your baby wheels, as your semi-coupled mode. And so it does take an ace pilot to kind of adjust to all that. And I guess the big change that we know of, at least, is going to be that there is a speed cap when you're flying around normally in what they call SCM, their standard control mode, which just puts a hard cap on your speed. You know, you're flying around in space, and if you want access to your boost, at some point your speed limit is gonna just lock. Your speed's gonna be locked around 300 or whatever, unless you press boost. And then it appears, and this is the really weird part about it, and then I'll let Avenger fill in the gaps. When you boost and you overspeed a little bit in space, even, right, where there is no drag, no resistance, let's say you'll reach 400 meters per second. And then when you let go of boost, something is going to slow you down. We don't yet know what that is. Is it going to be your thrusters? Is it going to be like space brake? Or is it going to be magic? Like think
Gravity.
about gravity. Think about the grav lefts though, right? They have this right now, this really weird artificial stick within your speed limit. So as a final thought, I'll say there is so much we don't yet know. We really do need some more answers. That's my take on it for now. So yeah, I'll let Avenger fill in his ideas and thoughts.
So that was well said. And I agree with a lot of those points. So just to verify, because it is early and I want to make sure I answer the right question.
Real quick, I think I'm getting an echo. Maybe Blackmaze on your end from Avenger. Go again.
Testing, audio, testing.
I think you're good.
Good. Anyway, so just to verify, the question was, what is the biggest change to the flight model? Is that what we're asking? Or like, what does it mean to us?
Yeah, no. Right now, we're just asking, kind of getting a basic description of what these changes are. So Blackmaze, I think, covered everything. Was there anything that you feel he might have missed on that front in terms of explaining the basics of it?
No. I don't think anything was missed that much. I just want to preface one thing. So we're moving. Here's the reality. In space, there's no drag in space. You know, acceleration is acceleration, right? Now, in space dogfighting with Star Citizen, we obviously can't accelerate to infinite speeds because A, the game probably couldn't handle it, or two, the desync would become, he's over there, so shoot at Stanton over here. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that would be an exciting experience for a lot of people, right? Also, the fight would be, hundreds of thousands of kilometers apart. So how do we simulate an accelerational based model without actually having unlimited acceleration speed limits, right? So think about it this way. If you have a Hornet and an Arrow, and they're both facing nose to nose, right? And one Hornet starts to push onto the other one with its main thruster. Assuming there are no speed caps whatsoever, the acceleration from the Hornet that's pushing onto the Arrow will always be constant. The Arrow, using its rear thrusters, which are less powerful, will be pushing backwards to try to get away. The Hornet will still close on the Arrow because the main thruster on the acceleration on the Hornet is significantly higher than the reverse acceleration on the ship it's chasing. Right? Yeah. Now, however, because we have speed caps, even at a high speed, let's say 1,200 meters per second, once we hit that ceiling, it's like no longer an accelerational based combat model. Now it's a top speed based combat model, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. Now, what they've done is quite ingenious, in my opinion, because it simulates what would happen in real space, but allows it also to keep stuff close together. Because the ship that's accelerating with its harder, bigger main thruster is going to close the distance under boost power than the person who's reversing with his reverse thrusters, right? Mm-hmm. So the person who's using their main thrusters to accelerate onto an opponent, whether it's a heavy fighter, light fighter, whatever, mostly I think it's going to be whatever fighter you're using. Typically, if you're pushing onto them with their mains, you're going to close the distance. Because if speeds were not an issue, the person using those mains would be able to close the distance, which is going to add for an interesting dynamic because it's going to allow people to engage people. So what it becomes now is once you turn your nose towards your enemy, you're now making a conscious decision to re-engage. If you do not do that, you're making a conscious decision to disengage. Right? And that's a big switch there because right now you can disengage and engage in the same breath, right? Because once you hit that ceiling, you basically go like, hey, buddy, I'm up here. Come meet me at this speed. And he can't ever push past it. He can't ever get closer to you, even though he has more acceleration on the advance. It's just we've hit this ceiling, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of folks I've seen in comments and stuff, they're saying like, oh, this is a step down from the flight model, this and that, and they're complaining. We can get into some other stuff, which I'm excited to get into, right? But this system, ironically enough, simulates what would happen in space more accurately, and on top of allowing fights to be closer or visible in your face, which I think is fantastic.
Well, let's talk about the idea of speed limits in general in the game, because we've always been limited at the max speed area of like around 1,000 to 1,500 meters per second. I'd say like most of the ships fall around there.
Sorry, mostly?
Maybe not. I don't know.
Because we've always had speeds around 300-400. Like
No,
actually,
no, no.
350 was like the fastest we had for the racers for a long time. It was only until we got 315 where the speeds went to ludicrous mode.
Wasn't it always pretty high? Am I that disconnected?
No.
Like we had like old cruise mode, remember, with high speeds too. But like,
Yeah.
remember,
But
like,
in between
depends on how
they
far
took
back
off the
we
cruise
go.
mode, and then all the way up until 315, it never got
I
that high?
joined in 313, and I was impressed by the fact that I could take an Aurora and go 1200 ms in space, no problem.
Right. So I'm talking way back from like 1.3. So like I was like from the very beginning, the majority of Star Citizen's development was actually within 300, 400.
Right.
And
But in the
then-
last
and then
several
eventually we started
years,
getting bigger speeds.
Okay. God, I thought I was like
Sorry.
completely off. So, but in the last few years, we've been used to this kind of artificial limit of around that high, 12 to 1,500 or 1,000 or whatever you'd say.
In the last 3-ish years, yeah, it's been.
So that still exists in quantum mode, but now we're seeing the shorter limit in SCM mode, and it feels like one part of the argument is that this is kind of limiting the sort of, I don't want to say immersive sim, but kind of unlimited player-defined limits of speed. And then the other people are saying, well, this is better for combat because it keeps it slower.
Slower. I like that word. It's so not true.
Why not?
Well, what's your definition of slow?
I
Velocity?
assume. I mean, I don't know. Ask them. I haven't put much thought into this, and to be honest, so I'm open to hearing both sides of this.
Hey, Blackmaze, would you like to weigh in on this one? What's your definition of like speed, fast? What's fast to you?
Well, here's the thing, right? I do enjoy combat, and I don't do it nearly enough. So I might say some things that might not make sense. And Avenger, by all means, correct me. But my experience, my thought is, and I don't think I agree with you about these speed caps, that's how it would be if we had no caps. Because I think it's all about acceleration, and acceleration for different, based on what axes. If I'm facing the player, my opponent, my retros have fewer thrust powers, so less acceleration, and that acceleration force could determine, your weakness, let's say, or your having a one-up on your opponent. Yeah, and that as well. Because people often talk about jousting. CIG talks about jousting. And I think jousting is a fundamental part of space combat, the way we have it anyway. I don't feel like we should be trying to create a World War II dogfighting game, because you can't. I'm going to do it. I'm going to mention Elite Dangerous, right? They also try this very hard. They have the speed caps. Ships are limited to 300 or 400, unless you boost and then you go over and then you slow down again. And we're going in that direction. And that game, in combination with much slower rotationals, does achieve that a little bit. But coming from that and going to Star Citizen and experiencing these unlocked, faster rotationals, higher top speeds, where it's based on acceleration and how you as an ace pilot manage your closing distance, relative speed to your opponent, has been awesome. And I feel like we're losing that, right? So what I mean by that is we're going to get speed locked much quicker. So I find it hard to fill in the blanks for what that will mean, but I feel like what we will lose is two opponents coming at each other hard, 1,000 meters per second. Now, if this is me on the left and I want to stop that joust, it is my responsibility to ensure that I start slowing down in time to stop that gap, and hell, maybe even go with him, right? So we're merging, and then I got to stop the merge and go with him in the same direction to kind of keep the relative speeds where I want them, while also trying to focus on my position, while also trying to ensure that I'm rotating so that the right thrusters are pointing in the right way with the accelerational power that they have. And with that in mind, I have the feeling that these speed limits, if we're talking specifically about combat, that these limits dumb down the game.
So I do agree that we are losing some aspects of the current system we have, which I have also come to enjoy, right? I do love the dopamine rush of looking into my corner at 1,000 meters per second and merging onto someone at 5K and getting right within 300 meters and just being like, ooh, it feels so good. You're just like right in the spot. I mean, there's a few games I get that experience. I'm just like, wow, that felt good, right? But you cannot deny the limitations of the top speeds that we have. I've always maintained this position. I said, like, we don't really have to change anything super fundamentally. You know, we could just keep the current system we have and drop it to 600 so that fights happen within 600 instead of ludicrous speeds, and still have all the lead turning, pre-turning, nose control, that stuff, right? But it's relative. So the point you made about accelerational based model, I don't understand where where you didn't see it, because I see it exactly how you explained it. That the person with the more powerful thrusters will have the accelerational advantage. It just happens within a smaller envelope, because the envelope in infinite space is not something the game can handle, nor would it be something that would be viable in a certain kind of sense. So they're like, we want to keep it, Chris wants to keep it within certain speeds, that stuff. Also, we're assuming that whatever speed changes that get done and the top speeds, that we are going to keep the current accelerations relative to the new top speeds. And I think that's just simply incorrect. At the present time, the Gladius can pull 21.8 or 21.9 Gs in a tricord. Now, I'm not sure if you know this, but as a racer, I'm sure you understand Gs quite well. That 21 Gs on the human body for more than a second would be catastrophically very bad for the human body.
Uncomfortable.
It was a really interesting experience for me coming from 313. That was my entry, where thrusters were quite weak. The acceleration, especially the strafe up, was just like all the other maneuvering thrusters, not very strong. And I loved it. I loved it because it makes it more important to manage what you have, which isn't a lot unless you're using main engine. So you got to turn and burn, let's say. So then we went to 314 and suddenly they had this whole balance, right? And this balance created the scenario where strafe up was magically boosted like insane. And now everyone is obviously just turning around each other using a lot of strafe up power, especially with boost, especially if you're tricording. So yes, I completely agree that that's ridiculous. And I would love to see that reduced. If, though, they do what you say and reduce these accelerational powers, and I, as someone who likes to whip across a planet, now
you do it in quantum mode.
No, but that's the thing, right? So if I'm going into QCM quantum mode and I am still experiencing these reduced accelerations, forget about strafe up, because I still agree that's way too strong right now. But just in general, I mean, everything is going to get really laggy and slow and drifty because I've got no boost anymore to lean on. So that's going to be interesting, right? So
I don't know about that. I think we're speculating on this one, because it would, first of all, we're assuming that we're going to keep current accelerations in a new flight mode, which I think, I look, I don't know this for sure, but if I was designing it, the cooldown time it takes to switch from standard control mode to quantum control mode, it takes a few seconds for it to quote unquote switch over, and it's creating like a warp bubble around the ship and all that stuff. The likelihood that we're going to keep accelerations the same and all that stuff, I think is just simply, I don't think that'll be the case. I think it's very likely that because it's a travel mode, I think if anything, it might actually either keep the G's the same because it's all about traveling and stuff, and then, or it might make it so that it's extremely main, like it's like your main thruster is like, that's where
this is so dangerous.
Control surfaces for like movement. I don't know. I mean, that's
But you're right. You're absolutely right. There is a lot of speculation. And so like when I responded to you, and for anybody that discusses this, between now and when we get more information, it's all speculation. And we're just, making do what we have in terms of facts on the system. And so I personally hope that they don't change accelerations. I feel like the current accelerations are almost acceptable if we don't have magical strafe up power the way we have now. If you're going to do it less, it might be more realistic, but I feel like you'd be cutting into the fun. But then again, here's the thing, right? You mentioned slower speeds. You've got that slower SEM limit now. What will that mean, right? If we do keep the same accelerations? Because here's the thing. If I'm in the current game, 317, if I'm dogfighting with somebody and I'm drifting 1,200 meters per second, and he's also drifting 1,200 meters per second, and we're both drifting in the same direction, our relative speed is almost nothing, right? So you could be dogfighting and orbiting around each other while also drifting, the same way we are doing right now through the Milky Way, right? You feel like you're not moving, but we're moving very fast. So what will it really change if they don't change accelerations? The only thing it'll change is the likelihood you won't correct in time for this really big speed difference and the gap it creates. That's how I would see it. So then it would make sense to have these lower accelerations to baby wheel the system even more. But I'm not sure if they're doing that. We haven't seen it, but.
So I remember back in 2.0 days. Because you came in at what, 313?
Yes.
I remember what Star Citizen felt like in the 2.0 days and whatnot. And our top speed on the Saber was 240. I remember that because I loved the Saber at the time. Now, the game at that time with the G-force model and switching off Gs and rolling your Gs off, and we had symmetrical thrust, we had max 240 speeds, and I can confidently say that the game at that time was, I think, at its highest skill ceiling I've played. Out of all the patches I've ever played, that one was the highest, right? Now, there are different attributes to the current system we have. There is different skill metrics, different skill checks. The current system we have now is still very skill-based. I would not consider the current system we have to be training wheels in any sort of way, even though when it first came out, everyone's immediate reaction was to say, this is a massive step down. And now I argue, well, I'd say it's just as difficult, as some of the older patches, right? And if they keep designing on it, I'm sure it would consider, adding more skill checks to power management and G-forces and all that stuff, right? The system we're moving to, although it might have some detrimental effects on some people's emotional states, the reality of the system is it fixes a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, right? I don't think it's going to feel like Elite Dangerous. I really don't. I've played Elite Dangerous. I wouldn't say I'm a very active player in Elite Dangerous, but I know the flight model and I've played it. It's slow. It's boring. You know what I mean? We have hit scan weapons. We have a lot of trading going on. There's very little positional gameplay. It's not the game that I play and I'm like, space dogfighter. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that you can't use some similarities. For example, Star Wars Squadrons. I use this as an example a lot of times. Even though it's not 6 degrees of freedom, there was a mechanic where you could basically shoot off angle almost all the time. So it wasn't 6 DOF, but I mean, most of the time I was shooting at 90 degrees or more, sliding through space, right? That game's top speed on the TIE Defender was 275 meters per second. But I can tell you right now that I have never felt a flight game that felt faster or that the feeling of speed was more visceral than a game like that, right? So why is that? You know what I mean? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One, the ship needs to feel like it's going fast. That's number one. Two, you need to have accelerations that are based on the environment as well as its relationship with other people. Three, you need to have rotations that aren't super, super stupidly high where you can have some kind of positional warfare. And four, weapon velocities make sense with the relative velocity of the ships they are shooting at. So if you have 1,400 meter per second guns and you're moving slower, you're going to hit everything. If you have 1,000 meter per second guns, you're going to have to get within, 200-300 or closer to like really reliably hit. And that's assuming you can get your turn rate to track the enemy at that range too, right? So this idea of like the system we're moving to having training wheels, or that it's going to be slower, I think comes from a fundamental assumption that we're going to keep similar accelerations and values and whatnot. Because if you do play the current model we have now and you just drop your SCM limiter to 300, it's basically just a nose-to-nose race where each person doesn't miss anything, and it's just like, and then get them. You know what I mean? But
Here's my question, though. Here's my question on this, because everything you say makes sense, and I totally get you, and I'm on board. But I feel like putting this SCM speed cap on it, just because everything you're saying is about combat, right? And it feels like, yeah, it might make sense for combat, but not necessarily for the rest. To add on to what you were saying in terms of feeling and having a sense of speed, I think a lot of that also comes from what have you got around you. You know, you need objects around you to experience speed, and it's very easy to miss the scale of things in Star Citizen when you're, for example, whipping around the space station, because not until you slow down and you see that little teeny tiny dude floating through space do you realize how fast you're actually going. So it makes sense. But then if you reduce accelerations as well, they're going to have to change something about the aerodynamics of the ships, because suddenly if you reduce aerodynamics, the ships won't even be able to push through an atmosphere anymore at the speeds they do right now, because they just won't have the power to overcome the drag. And with that in mind, I feel like the thrust power we have now is okay. So if they also reduce thrust all around, it's gonna, what is that gonna do? Again, questions that we don't have an answer to.
Okay, so can I get some clarification when you say like not good for the rest? Are you saying like not good for haulers, miners, industrial pilots to be able to just disengage with this new system?
I mean, to get a flight experience in general for anybody that enjoys flight, whether you're doing mining or hauling or formation flying, starting in space and dipping down through the air, through the atmosphere and down into the planet, and having an exciting feeling. I feel like if you are going to put just SCM and QCM in without any other changes, I don't really see a big problem, because we can still go 600 meters per second entering information down to a planet, for example, or that miner can still whip through the asteroids at 400 meters per second without feeling like he's limited to 300 or less, depending on what they do. But if they also reduce accelerations, I think that will have a big impact on how we experience flight, because it will reduce top speeds way below SCM limits because of drag. And I feel like anyone that does enjoy what is often called hooning, you know, just racing around the planets or whipping around the station, they're going to have to do that at much slower speeds, because they won't have the braking power, right? Which then creates the scenario where it's going to feel very slow because you haven't got enough stuff around you.
So, okay, I hear you. I 100% hear you. So what would be a speed? Like, for example, you say racing, basically, I think what I'm hearing is, and tell me if I'm right in this, is you want the experience to know what it feels like to go too fast, in a sense. You know what I mean? You want there to be, because right now with our top speeds being 250, you know, as a racer, and I've raced too, it is like, yeah, that's like fast, but it's like not, you know, it's not like you're driving, you know, a McLaren down the highway at 220 miles an hour. You're holding the wheel and you're white knuckling it, and you're just like, oh my God, I gotta be careful here. You know what I mean? Or where you're driving your buddy's, you know, Honda Civic, and you're topping out at 110, and you're just kind of like putting in the right hand lane. I get that. So what would be a speed that would would feel like, oh, this is fast? Like I gotta
Where?
Exactly. Where?
That's
a good question, right? So would you say that, let's say the snake pit, what would be a top speed for the snake pit? Would you feel like would be?
I'll answer this the way I did in my video. For those, allow me to plug myself here, Space. I did a video on SCM and QCM, and basically what I did is, with the knowledge we have, I tried to replicate what SCM feels like and what QCM feels like. And I used the speed limiter to do this. I aimed for 300 meters per second with SCM, and I went flying around in different locations. I went into atmosphere. I whipped around the station. I went to a thin atmosphere, like Cleo, the Snake Pit Avenger, you just mentioned it. And I went to an Earth-like, a denser atmosphere, Hurston, Lorville. And I went into SEM and felt what it feels like. If you're in space, to answer your question, I think anywhere between 300 and 600 meters per second feels fast enough to feel like you're flying and having a sense of motion. And with enough accelerational thrust power to stop yourself from drifting too much. A thin atmosphere like Clio, a snake pit, that snake pit racetrack, that CIG put in game is really, I mean, if you put yourself on the ground, you'll be surprised at how massive that space is. But when you're racing through it in a spaceship, SEM speeds are fine. That's my conclusion in my video too. If you rarely go over 300 meters per second. So if we don't reduce accelerational thrust power, I would expect those locations to have no difference in how they would feel. Now, I went to Hurston. This is very close to an Earth-like. I believe it's slightly less dense. If you're flying in QCM, so unrestricted right now, let's say a Razor will do 330 meters per second, which is right around the ballpark of the sound of speed at an Earth-like atmospheric density, right? Very important.
I agree, though. The Earth-like, any atmosphere tuning right now is just completely out of whack. They need to dramatically increase their speeds in atmosphere, I think. Like, it needs to take a small hit in top speed, but I don't think the top speed should take a very big hit when it comes to flying in atmosphere. I think the biggest change should feel with control surfaces and like the forcing into a pitch model rather than
right. Yes, I agree. Not a lot of people will be happy with you making that statement. There's a lot
but
of
right
people
now the A2 Hercules can outrun a Gladius in atmosphere, so I don't know.
Of course. There are so the really interesting thing about Star Citizen right now is that, and you can find this in one of the older Star Citizen live videos, they show you the aerodynamic planes that they have modeled on the ship, right? They show you the squares, and these squares will decide drag and lift and whatever else. And I'm sure a Hercules, you combine three factors in atmosphere. You've got those aerodynamic planes, you've got the mass of the ship and the thrust power. So you get thrust to weight ratio with, on top of that, how aerodynamically efficient are you? And the Hercules definitely has some kind of mathematical mistake there to make it so much faster than everything else. But yeah, a Razor doing right around the sound of speed, I think is fine. And with SEM, we will not, right? Depending on boost, here we go again, right? Like if you don't boost and you are limited, it's going to feel very strange. And maybe that's something we have to give up, right? That's the big question. Is it worth it to give up that experience and put on those limits in place to save all the rest of the combat specifically? That's a question I can't answer yet.
But, and this is an important thing to make too, because he says this during the little thing too. He said, the current speeds that we have are like basically like the placeholders. Like we're going to tune until we get it right. You know what I mean? He says that, but like here's the thing. I think people get lost in the woods when it comes to specific number checks, right? The numbers can change. I mean, we can get to a point where the top of the SCM limit is 450, 500 for most fighters. And that right there would be like, everything's fine. You can still lead turn, you can still close, all the stuff we love, but we don't have all the other silly stuff with like ludicrous speed and all, because you want to have something, right? Because we're kind of going off a single snippet during that video where we saw the Gladius in atmosphere and it topped out at 250 and everyone's like, oh my God, we're so slow. I get it. But it all goes together. You know what I mean? Like accelerate and also jerk profile too, right? Like the whole having really fast accelerations is important, right? But being able to, the whole issue with like wiggling or instant motion gameplay, right? Where, you're here and then all of a sudden your ship translates to here and to here. And it's just, your ship essentially, like we had this issue way back in the day as well. And a lot of people compare the old flight models to what was that? A hummingbird on cocaine.
Yeah, I remember that.
Like, you know what I mean? And even Chris, I remember during one of his presentations, he saw there was a Hornet that like flew in wing with him, and he like wasn't a very good pilot, so he was like trying to get he was trying to get beside him, and the ship was basically going like this to try to like form in with him, and Chris was like, we're gonna have to fix that. I get it, you know what I mean? It's like Chris wants Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica. That's what he wants, right? He wants there to be the
He's
sense
been
of space.
clear about that from the beginning, right?
And I got nothing wrong with that, right? Because in both of those situations, we have too fast, we have chasing, we have proper dogfighting, we have all the right combat metrics in place. Now, specifically when it comes to racing, I think when it comes to racing, it all comes down to map design when it comes to racing, right? Now, low flying, you can argue, will be not as super crazy high speed, but that's assuming that QC mode also doesn't push our speeds maybe even higher, or maybe even feel just as good, because it might be a more main thruster acceleration based model. I don't know, right? But until we get the hands on basically the fast travel mode, I think low flying might still just be just as fun with that mode, right?
I agree. And again, that's a conclusion I made in the video. I said, because I went to Tamar, right? One of the thinnest atmosphere planets where people love to go ripping around the canyons and the hills. And they often bring, look at Tarada. They'll bring an arrow and they'll do 400 meters per second, and they'll be,
Someone's at the door. Can I give you? Can you just?
Of course.
Someone's at the door. I'll be right back.
I'll keep talking and give space.
I'm here.
The opportunity to ask a question. But I think my conclusion was that it will probably still be fun, because even with 300 meters per second and some boost, you can have fun. But hit us with your thoughts, Space.
Well, the thing that I keep hearing during this whole conversation is that it's not so much about one thing becoming worse or not, but rather just the change from what was before to what was now. And it feels like that change, or at least the conversation surrounding it, is largely based on the idea of player choice versus forcing fun. Do they want to continue to allow for players to choose how they're flying and expect them to fly responsibly in a way that would make for fun combat? Or do they want to begin to impose more artificial limits to make sure that they can make sure that combat is fun, because they have found that players just won't do that themselves? And that's something they mentioned in the video, that they've been trying to put these different things into combat in order to encourage people to fly slower, but that hasn't worked. And this was something that I definitely wanted to ask you both, but do you feel like the efforts that they've gone through to maintain the player choice but also try and encourage that combat have gone far enough to justify them just saying, you know what, we're going to put limits on it ourselves?
That's such a tough question, man. I think CIG, I want to preface it by saying that CIG has been so observant of what communities do. And I think racing is one of the most recent joiners in that. Mm-hmm. Because we've been doing so much racing, CIG loves it, and so they look at what we do and they keep racing in mind. So I am, first of all, convinced that they're looking at all aspects of the game in making these decisions. But I do feel, because we're talking about just adding a limit, we're just imposing a limit. There's not really a change in the flight experience or how handling works or how rotating works, as far as we know, other than putting in a speed limit. Mm-hmm. To me, it does feel like it is to fix a problem with combat that I am not yet convinced of is a problem, but also how focused on squadrons is it? Because there is a big difference between a single player game where you have a zone, a map, an area, and you're sending a dude, you're sending the pilot, CIG is sending the pilot on a mission. You have to fly to that location and you've got to go and kill some dudes or do a mission or whatever. But then if you can go 1300 MS, it's really easy to get out of the level space, and it makes it feel more cramped if you're trying to design, let's say, a single player game. So yeah, maybe there is a balance to be struck there. And of course, Avenger 1 makes a really good point. There is still so much we don't know. We don't know the thrust, the speed limits yet per ship. We don't know how they will balance it. And that's where we can all, as the alpha community players, that's where we have the responsibility, I think, to keep giving our feedback and ideas. And I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think... Well, I'm wondering, does it feel like we're losing a little bit of the sim part of the space sim when they make a change like this?
For sure, it does. I mean, it's a limit. often enough, like even in my video, I mention it will feel less Newtonian-like, right? And then people say, but it's already not realistic because you're speed locked at 1300. You slow down when you don't input anything. Yes, I get it. We're not doing 12,000 kilometers per second like an asteroid in real life orbiting a planet or a star or whatever. I get it. But we did feel like we were able to loosely experience spaceflight as you would expect, but we might still with QCM. We don't know.
Yeah, that was always the whole speed limit thing was always the thing that really took away from that idea that we were getting full control. But even then with uncoupled mode, up until that point, you had a full range of freedom in terms of speeds and what you were doing at them. And now I think the biggest thing that you've pointed out is just not having boost when you're in QCM mode means that you are much more limited in terms of your maneuvers and, as you've been saying, your acceleration at those higher speeds.
It's a good observation, but it's actually really interesting. Another one of our racers, Data Machine, he and I love hanging out and just flying around together, formation flying, and in any kind of traversal, any moment that you're traveling or flying together or even whipping around asteroids or trying to do some low hooning is still a lot of fun without boost. So we even did some racing where we said, okay, you're not allowed to touch boost. And it becomes really fun because what becomes apparent is that boost is a crutch almost, where you don't have infinite amounts, so you have to preserve it for the moments where you need it the most, which often ends up in the turn and coming out of the turn. And in the turn, it basically means that you can approach a turn really fast and then hit the boost. That's your crutch. It'll allow you to slow down faster and then continue. But if you don't have boost, suddenly you have to think ahead. Okay, this is my current speed. This is my stopping power without boost. This is the thrust I always have available, and it is always the same. And so you change your approach a little bit, which feels very immersive actually, because you don't have the dynamic of thrust power shift. And so even without boost in QCM, if they don't change anything else, it's going to be a lot of fun. And then it just comes down to an immersion point of view. It seems very cheaty, gamey to say, okay, just to have no speed limit, you must have a bubble on and you can't have a shield.
Right.
And then it just becomes, okay, now it's just a Band-Aid.
Yeah. And I think, again, more questions come up as to what constitutes, like, what do you have to do to be in SCM versus quantum mode? Because if somebody is per se in quantum mode, I'm assuming they can't use their interdiction, but we haven't really heard much about that. It'd make a lot more sense if it was only limited to SCM mode so that you could outrun them. But again, once they start bringing in these kinds of, I guess, artificial, like the lore explanation of it is that, oh, this breaks your shield bubble, so you can't have it on. And then you get all these questions of, well, what doesn't and what does? And it starts to get a little more confusing.
And I think it's fair, right? Like to say, okay, to be in QCM so that you can do the quantum boosting, which looks really cool, by the way. And I think that's probably something that we're not talking about. Because
that's my side of the conversation. Concerns. I love the quantum boost idea.
Dude, me too. I think the idea of QCM is ingenious. I think the whole press boost and you can just blast 50,000 approach the moon, just point at the moon and fly there. That sounds really exciting. And it makes sense that in that you can't use your weapons or maybe your shield because, you need to direct this power to this quantum bubble. I think all of that makes sense. The only thing for me that doesn't tie in from an immersion standpoint, forget about balance for a second, is the speed limit. Why am I suddenly in space not able to reach the same speed, right? It's just so arbitrary.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I do wish that it had somehow tied into resource management and balancing your power and what takes more power and whatnot. But I also I get it at this point. Maybe this isn't the way CIG is going, but like they are getting to a point where they're like, okay, we've we've done what we can to make this work, but we need to get to a point where like all of this actually functions and works together, and this is an easier way to do it. So instead of including all of this and stacking it on top of resource management, let's just say this is the way it works and go forward with it. How was your trip, Avenger?
It's good. It was my neighbor. He needed a boost.
Ah.
His car died. So I helped him out.
Cool.
He's a good kid, young guy though.
What were you saying, Blackmaze?
I don't remember. Maybe you want to recap for Avenger. I don't remember. We said so many things.
Oh yeah, we got off on the conversation, but how about I just start us off with a new line of questioning. So I guess when you left, we were kind of getting into the conversation of how this might take away from the sim, but we also followed that conversation to show that it does take away from the sim aspect of the game, in that it's a little more arcadey, but it also adds more opportunities for players to improve their skill. Blackmaze was saying, for instance, without the boost in the racetrack, you guys become a little more aware of how you used boost and how you can improve your flight skills because now you don't have it. And there are other ways that this can open up the field for more types of play. But I want to go in a different direction now and ask a little more about, because you guys come from racing and combat being kind of different styles, especially when you take it from space into atmosphere. How do you feel about the thrusters on your ship, the maneuvering thrusters versus the main boosters? How is that a tool for you? What makes it important for racing or for combat? I want to know if it's different between you two.
Be my guest, Maze?
No, I'll let you go first. I've been rambling while you were gone.
Okay. So what's the difference between mains and mavs when compared to combat or racing, correct?
Well, for you specifically in combat, how are you thinking about those thrusters?
Well, for combat, you always have to make sure that you have an idea of where your bottom thrusters are, because that's the most important, right? I mean, I'd love to use my main thrusters to create deflections, but it's just simply, obviously, mains can only push forward, so that controls your distance. But any deflections based on counter maneuvering should come from your bottom thrusters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Should they?
Well, most counter maneuvers should come from the bottoms, right? Side thrusters are important too, because it helps you deflect off angle, right? But if you're down strafing to try to create deflection, like, you're just going to get smoked.
No, but should they? Is my question. Do you think it should be that way?
Okay. Sorry. I thought you were asking in terms of should they to be a better combat pilot? Because
No, they do.
I'm very dogmatic. I think one way.
No, you're fine.
So-
You're fine.
I don't know, but I know that it feels good in a lot of situations. You could make the argument that the way they're designed, that, in order, because a lot of times, like, I'm sure you've seen it too, where you see a Gladius and it's like pitching nose down like 90 degrees, like staring on top of somebody. And you look at that and you kind of go like, really though? Right? Even though the thrusters, again, they're very powerful, and you could argue that could be the case, and sure, right? It just looks a little wonky, right? It would look a little better if the ship was flat, so you could tune it so that bottom thrust. And again, right, like, we know the human body likes to pull negative G's, right? So if you're pulling positive G's, so if you're pulling those G's, like, if you were designing a spaceship that you knew a pilot was going to fly, you'd want them to push in those directions, right? So I mean, there's lots of ways you could argue that designing a ship with better bottom thrusters will help the ships fly more aerodynamically, even in space, to create this much more classic dogfighting feel mixed with the 60 OF stuff, right? I get where they're coming from. I like it in a lot of situations. There are other ways to do it. There are other ways to bring symmetrical thrust back, but still have positional gameplay. And you have that with a G-force model, where pulling G's in all the other directions is much more difficult on the human body, which is true. So you're not limited by it's very easy for the ship to overcome the pilot, right? So then the pilot really has to develop that connection between them and the platform they're flying, right? I mean, it's really like that. I mean, it's like that in today's world too. You fly an F-22. I mean, the IFCS system on the F-22 is going to limit you on a lot of turns, because, I mean, the F-22's frame is capable of killing the pilot 2-3 times over, right? But obviously, we don't want to do that.
That's not good.
We limit the abilities of the platform in order to maintain the pilot's health, right? Now, obviously, in a drone world, that's not the case, but we're not playing drones in space because that would be more realistic. We would not have dogfights in space if it were simulation, right? So this argument of like, oh, it has to be more sim. I mean, those people need to understand that if this was sim, then we would not have pilots in fighters, right?
Taking it
So
to an
that's
extreme.
Avenger. I think that's a mistake that I think that's a comment that frustrates anybody that says that. And in their defense, I'll say they're obviously not meaning we need more sim like in the sense of realism.
It has
And
to
so
feel
it should be-
believable.
It should handle the way you expect real life physics to feel. That's, I guess, what people mean when they say I want sim like stuff. It's not, yeah, if this was real life, we wouldn't have people in it. No, it's like if this was real life, I can keep accelerating.
Well, it right, but the thing is, the game cannot do that, right? So the best compromise is because we got two problems here. One, if we put top speeds on, then people will play at the border of the top speed, and they'll basically exploit the fact that you can't work an angle around somebody because you're hitting that imaginary wall, right? So that's problem number one. Problem number two is you can't have infinite speed because the servers would just turn into molten lava and we wouldn't have a game to play, right? So the solution is, okay, if we hit that imaginary ceiling, we can increase that ceiling and we basically have the mini game of power management, right? Where if I'm more efficient with my power, if I'm smarter with when I use it, if I'm more conservative with it, if I'm using it at the right times, then when I get to that ceiling of speed or whatever, then I can use my boost to get around the guy and he can't like counter that in a sense because he's used up his energy, right? So now you have a dynamic of energy play, which will be in the new system, which will fix that problem, right? And these are fundamental mechanical things that need to get fixed, right? You know, and that in and of itself, I think, like this whole model, not is based around PvP, but like this model has player interaction at its core, right? The argument of like, oh, it was designed for Squadron 42, and it's just like the system. It's like, no, you're not listening hard enough because this system is designed for the interaction of players because it fixes these core issues, right?
But it was designed for Squadron, right? I mean, they
right,
said that.
Right, but look at how they designed it. Like they have PvP / player interaction / humans interacting with each other in a dogfight situation at its core. Because if you wanted just a player versus environment game, we could use the current model we have, just tune it, adjust some things, and we're fine, right? But in order for Star Citizen, the open world, to have a model that allows for all the different dynamic changes with ships and allows multi-crew ships to be competitive and all that stuff, like it fixes so many more issues than quote unquote creates, you know what I mean? And the issues that it creates are speculation based on incomplete facts. And I feel like a little bit undeserving because if you really look hard enough, I mean, it's easy to fix those imaginary issues that they claim.
Well, as a comment said here in the chat, it would be interesting to hear more about how this improves the situation or makes the situation more fun for players in the future. But before we get to that, I do want to ask, because you mentioned a couple things there, the idea of the resource management tying into this, and also the idea of allowing people to, fly around at that speed, but not being able to really do anything at that speed. And one thing we talked about when you were gone was that they mentioned that they tried to put these different things in the way, basically blocking players or encouraging players to stay slower so that their weapons go better, that missiles fly better, just different things to encourage them to fly at slower speeds. But I feel like they could have gone even further with that, making it so that if you're flying at 600 or let's say whatever the cap is on SEM speeds that they're putting on with this new system, if they could have just said your weapons won't hit anything at that speed before, wouldn't it effectively do the same thing? Nobody would ever fly above that speed for combat if your weapons just straight up didn't shoot straight. So could they have still put that restriction on there?
Yeah, but that's adding like a really finicky game mechanic.
This is why I say baby wheels, right? Because it's not about, because then you're encouraging people to stay below the speed. But encouraging people to stay below the speed has proven insufficient. People need to be forced below the speed. And that's
the
tickles me
inevitability.
sideways. And I think that's the the difference.
Are we concerned that possibly we're going to be losing out on opportunities to lead turn? We're going to be losing out on opportunities to gain position. We're going to be losing out on opportunities to control.
I got a question
distance.
for you. I got a question for you on that. I was wondering about this. 2 questions, one of which might be a little offensive. Do you combat decoupled or coupled?
I combat decoupled.
Right. So if you're decoupled, right?
But I've flown coupled. I prefer coupled, but yes.
Right. Okay. So let's say that you are flying 1,000 meters per second toward your target, and he's flying 1,000 meters toward you.
Yeah. That
means that once you pass each other, you are flying away from each other at 2,000 meters per second. Right.
That's correct.
That's a lot of speed difference there that needs to be broken. That's gonna obviously get reduced. And some related to that is boost, right? Right now with decoupled, if you are boosting and you stop boosting, you maintain the speed. But in SEM, you will not. You boost, then you let go of boost. Some magical system of which we don't yet know what it is will slow you down.
Oh, I know where this is coming from. Yeah, I know where you're going with this.
Flying decoupled, like how are you going to experience that, and what are your thoughts on it? It's my question.
I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen when I reach the barrier of standard control mode and then enter the boost afterburner zone. And then when I'm no longer boosting and I'm still in decoupled, do I maintain that speed?
No,
right?
I'm pretty sure.
I don't think I will.
Speculation. I don't.
Oh, that's going to be jarring.
How will you? Yeah, especially in vacuum where you don't expect it. How will that affect your ability to combat? Be on top of what your ship's doing, and yeah, I'm just curious about your ideas on how that will affect your experience, your combat experience specifically.
I think it's a mechanical part of the system that, I mean, I don't think it'll feel bad in a sense, right? Because the idea is to get close and raid fight people, right? So get in close, get under their turn rate, like watch the geometry of the battle, right? Get out of their nose cone, get a gun position, understand the differences between the fighter you're engaging and the fighter that you're currently in. Like if you're in a Hornet or a medium fighter, you don't want to get too close. You want to create ovalistic or like slingshots. If you're in a raiding fighter like an Arrow, you want to close distance and lead turn to get within that gap. Like if you're in a heavy fighter, you want to create even larger slingshots with like a turret in terms of angle for the turret. Like it's the same geometry at different speeds.
Another question then. Let's say that you are in that joust and we're in SEM speed. You're boosting past him and you are beyond SEM speed. And now you let go of boost, so a system is going to slow you down. If that system is your thrusters, it would mean that if you turn around to face your target, you will stop faster than if you keep looking away from him because your retros are weaker than your mains.
Yeah.
So then the slowdown becomes dynamic. That sounds awful to me because it's very gamey. But what are your thoughts on it? And do you think that you would embrace that feeling in 0G?
Gamey up until you reach the top of your standard combat tuning.
Yeah, above it. I'm talking obviously above it.
Yeah, once you enter boost, you have a limited time in there, and when you let go of boost, like your ship's going to slow down, right? Like you need to there's going to be kind of adaptation period in terms of how the feeling of the combat will be, right? Whether it's good or bad, whether it's uncomfortable, I don't know. I can tell you this, that when I switched initially to decoupled mode, that's a nice spot to freeze on. When I initially switched to coupled mode, I spent a week and a half, and I was miserable. I hated it. Like I at times wanted to quit the game. I at one time was like so angry. I couldn't even stream for the day because I was so mad at like flying decoupled. I absolutely hated it. Hated everything about it. And now I fly decoupled and it's as natural as coupled. It's just I know my ship now, right? And no matter what system gets implemented, no matter what changes they make, there will be an adaptation period. Some people will hate it, but the trick is to keep going and then like keep learning it. And then eventually you'll learn it so good, you'll be like, okay, this feels really great, right? Now, some systems will feel great right off the bat, right? Then maybe this will be one of those systems where you think it's going to feel like crap or whatever. And then you play it and you're like, no, this actually feels pretty good, right? Because don't forget too, once you hit your standard combat mode or standard control mode, Jesus Christ, then if you're in decoupled, you're going to maintain that velocity. So it's like you're still going to be, moving in any direction you want to be moving in until you start manually moving. So it's just one more thing that you as a pilot have to adapt to. But the geometry of the fight is still the same. The option to be at higher energy is based on having more boost saved up and more management in your power system, right? Which again, like I said before, simulates what an infinite accelerational model would look like, where the guy with the main thruster is always going to be able to accelerate faster than the guy that's nosing off and reversing, right?
Another question. Sorry, Space.
No, go ahead.
How do you think missile gameplay will get into this? Because obviously right now you've got that you can't shoot it within the distance, but that bubble is going to shrink. So how do you think that will change? Or how do you think it should change, or not at all? Sorry, I'm taking over the role of interviewee here, Space. Forgive me.
I'm audience at this point. I'm typing in chat.
That's okay. I got to be careful what I say here, because I want to be very clear about my position on this, and that I don't have a position, right?
Doesn't sound that way, Avenger.
Really? So I don't know what they're going to do with missiles. I know that the current missile system is atrocious. Missiles have been atrocious for a long time. They've been a sticking point for me because they really get in the way of skill-based gameplay, right? Now, I want missiles to have a place in the game. I want them to be fun and enjoyable. I know for a fact that I've played games that have missiles that feel fine, right? That feel really skill-based, that also feel like they have tons of checks and balances. X-Wing versus TIE Fighter was one of them. The X-Wing series was one of them. The TIE Fighter series was one of them. Squadrons was one of them. Freelancer had a good one. Battlestar Galactica Dysphoria had a good system. Like, there's been a lot of great 90s almost like space shooters that had these missile mechanics figured out long before Star Citizen, right? When it comes down to like being able to target incoming missiles, now technically you can do that right now, but the reality is they move so fast and they jitter and the desync that reliably targeting missiles, especially if they're fired 4 at a time, like you're not going to shoot those missiles down, right? Likelihood is you're just going to try to get up to full speed and get away from them, right? But like, we need better countermeasures. We need better chaff clouds. We need better missile mechanics. We need better targeting systems for the different types of missiles. We need better warning systems for the types of missiles. We need better behavior for the missiles themselves when it comes to short-range missiles to long-range missiles. We need torpedo mechanics. Like,
good luck with all that.
The list goes on. I mean, the missile system in general is probably the biggest thing that hangs on combat, second to the actual flight itself, right? In the new system, I think the missiles at the beginning will probably either feel like, why would I use missiles? Or basically a disengagement tool, right? Where someone's trying to run, it's like, all right, well, then I'll throw some missiles at you and we'll play the mini game of dodge the missile, right? I don't want to have gameplay where I'm getting fired on by Fox 2s at 200 meters. Like, I don't find that fun. I don't think that's enjoyable. I don't like the whole idea of, within gun range, just slinging Fox 2s. I don't like that idea. What I do like is missiles to become a team style weapon, to become a tactical choice on the battlefield, but not to become so overpowered or overbearing or over oppressive where somebody who's just played the game 10 days in or whatever shows up in a Talon Shrike or a Freelancer miss and just drinks his coffee, watches The Simpsons, and just presses the big red button. You know what I mean? Like, I don't find that to be a fun experience, right? Because that is not healthy for combat, right? Where I'd like to see the missile system go, just to wrap this up, is give us different styles for missiles, like how we have different styles now for ships, like certain missiles for certain types, right? A size 9 torpedo, I shouldn't have to say this, but I have to. A size 9 torpedo should not be able to track and kill a light fighter. Like, I don't care what world you live in, it should not happen, right? just like a size 1 missile should not one-shot a heavy fighter Scorpius. But that's the world we're currently living in, which unfortunately, hopefully we'll leave soon.
I think overall, this has just shown us how many more questions there are surrounding this. And I think this applies to a few of the things that they talked about at CitizenCon. Just a lot of open-ended questions. Most of these things probably could have been announced in the Star Citizen Live, and we would have been coming away better informed, I think, and more sure of different opinions on it. But just to wrap things up here, I do want to go back to the main question that I did see in chat, and I think is a very important one. For the general player who's joining this game, and let's take into account your bounty hunters, your mercenaries, your traders, your racers, your salvagers, anybody who needs to be traveling and around in the game or maybe defending themselves. Is this going to be something that makes the game more fun and interesting for them? Or will it, I guess not or, and will it hamper the experience because of the restrictions it's putting on what we've had before? Will that even be noticeable to players? What do you guys think?
Well, I know exactly what to say of this.
I think for combat probably, but I said this while Avenger was gone. I feel like it's very combat focused. I think SCM is made for combat, and so maybe for that I'll let Avenger 1 answer it specifically the combat. But the rest of the game, I don't think it'll affect at all how you experience the game. I think it only limits those that want to go beyond certain boundaries that we don't have right now. But so for the beginner player, I don't think it'll do much in general.
Would you say then that it compacts the I don't want to say the skill ceiling, but the experience ceiling, I guess, for general players, casual players?
No, I don't think they'll notice.
Okay. Avenger 1?
Yeah, I am very, very passionate about this question because I think there is a large amount of confusion, fear, and misunderstanding when it comes to the new system, and people's gut reaction is to say, I will no longer be able to disengage. You know, I am a miner, I am a trader, I am a hauler. You know, I should not. My only option shouldn't be, you know, hire escorts, right? Like, you know, screw you, Avenger. Like, I want to be able to disengage. I want to be able to choose my engagement. Well, guess what? The current system we have is already here for that. You cannot disengage in the current system. In fact, you cannot run away. You cannot disengage, and you cannot fight back. You will die to a single Gladius in the largest ship in the game with all your turrets filled. That's the current system we have. So this argument of Avenger, I won't be able to disengage, I won't be able to fight back, and blah, blah, blah. It's already here. It's already here. You can't run away if you're in a Caterpillar. You're done. You can't close distance on a Gladius. You're dead. Your turret, ineffective. If you're in a Hammerhead, a group of light fighters can kill you, which are what it's designed to kill, right? If you're in a Starfare, you cannot escape an Aurora. If you are in anything that's a hauler, you are already dead to some of the simplest, smallest ships in the game. I mean, a Dragonfly can kill a Caterpillar if it takes long enough and you can shoot the same shield facing. Like, it's absolutely ludicrous, this idea of, but Avenger, like, you know, I again, I'm a hauler, I'm a trader, I'm a this, I'm a that. You know, how do I get away? And also with these crazy high speeds for combat, you know, miners are going around Lyra doing their thing, and then boom, they get something on the radar at 5K, and within a second and a half, like, or 2 seconds, 3 seconds, boom, the guy's already on top of them. And they barely have barely enough time to slam into VTOL mode and try to get away, but it's too late. You're already dead, right? So, you know, this whole idea of this new system is going to make that worse, I think it melts my brain. It makes me so angry because it comes from such a fundamental misunderstanding and ignorance of what combat is. In the new system, you're going to have more of an opportunity to get away. You will have more of an opportunity to fight back. You will have more of an opportunity to survive. Period. End of story, full stop, right? And here's why. So let's say you're in, I don't know, C2 Hercules. You're loading up medical supplies. You're doing whatever you want to do. And, you know, you want to make a chicken run to some moon, right? Well, it just so happens that when you go to OM 3, 4, whatever, there's a Hornet there or whoever with a bad attitude and a Mantis or whatever, right?
Mhm.
In the current system we have, that Mantis will stop you from warping, and your only option is to either surrender. I mean, you could log off, but that's going to be taken away from you at some point, so that's not a viable option. I mean, your only option truly is to surrender, because if you try to dogfight or get into any kind of combat with that light fighter or that medium fighter, you simply will not be able to apply the damage, because you won't be able to get closer than 300-400 meters because you don't have acceleration. You're also physically very large, so he's going to be able to hit you, but you can't hit him. And so we're in this pickle, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Where the only viable option for that C2 is to either bring a scout for him to come in first and be like, it's clear, or bring an escort so that if he does get himself in that situation, he has somebody who can peel him off and then he can warp away, right? In the new system, two things are going to happen. One, the distances will get closer, which means your turrets will become more effective. That's number one. Two, energy management is going to be much more important, because if you save up all your power in your engines and you don't switch it to your weapons or your guns, and you're just interested in running, then you're going to stay at those higher energy speeds for longer, which means you'll eventually be able to separate the gap because you're going to have much more boost saved up. You can stay at those high speeds for longer with your main thrusters pushing away from him until eventually you can get the distance you want, and boof, off you go. Right? The turrets are going to create what's called reverse pressure, where they're going to swing to 6 o'clock and they're going to start shooting at whoever's chasing. And if you're in a Gladius with high speed, you're going to have to corkscrew, you're going to have to start moving around, which is going to extend the amount of distance you have to cover to chase your targets, which means you're going to have to use more energy. You're going to have to use your guns. You're going to have to keep swapping power between your charging, all these things. Eventually, you're going to create distance and you'll be able to get away. Unless
That's
there's
assuming that all ships have the same top speed in SEM.
Well,
What if they give a Caterpillar 150 ms top speed and a Gladius 300, and you still have the same problem? What are your ideas on that?
right. Well, that's a tuning issue, but that's not a mechanical issue, right?
No,
That's
I'm sure.
that's a tuning issue when it comes into, okay, the Caterpillar is not fast enough to be able to manage a disengage, right? So, they want it, like they might have to go into the numbers and be like, we're going to give it 200 now, right? And we're going to give it 200 meter per second standard and 300 boost, right? Now the Gladius can get 350, but it's going to bleed those 50 meters per second off, creating all the momentum to change its vector, because it's going to get shot at by turrets, right? So you're going to add, again, this adds into gameplay. This adds into disengagement theory. This adds into shield switching, so that you're pushing your shields to one side of your ship or the other to get away. Like in the new system, you at least have a bloody chance. In the system we have now, man, you're checkmate. And there ain't nothing you can do about it.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to drive that home, because, and again, this whole like, well, I'm just going to slam into QT mode and run away. It's like, okay. Let me know how that works out for you. Let me know what turning your shields off for 8 seconds is going to do to you in combat. You know what I mean? It's like, you might get away from a single light fighter, but you're going to take some serious damage. But if there's a couple guys on you and you turn your shields off to try and spool up your quantum, and also we've already been told that if you try to spool up quantum and you're taking fire from distortions, for example, like your spool timer gets reset. So you're indefinitely held there if your shields are down and you're trying to spool up, right?
So that, I feel like that's what scares people, though. The idea that they won't be able to
so
ever.
You need to disengage with standard tuning until until you're able to distance yourself enough where you can reliably go into QT mode and get out, right? And also, I don't see, like, are we still here's a question: can we just go straight into quantum, like in terms of like jump mode from standard control mode, like how we do now, just target a moon and turn quantum on and off we go? Like, do we have to switch into these higher speeds, or can we just go straight into quantum once we're outside of the weapon range of the Gladius, for example? Right, we're at 2,200 meters, and it's still chasing, and it's out of energy, it's tired, whatever, right? Then just warp off. You know what I mean? Unless he's got a Mantis, but that's a different story. If he's interdicting you because he's an ambush crew, well, if he's interdicting you, then you have two choices. One, you can call for help, and you can extend the amount of time as much as you can to buy time for people to come help you, or you can surrender. Right? Because if he's caught you with an interdictor and they're designed to take you out and you have no escorts, Like, people have to realize that, like, risk is part of the game. And this is a problem in EVE Online too, which I played for a very long time. It's like, if you jump into null security space and you get bubbled by an interdictor, like, and you brought no scout, you brought no people to fight, like, of course you're gonna get killed. Right? Like, you're not gonna find people interdicting folks at, like, you know, the higher security areas, Earth, and that kind of stuff. Like, there's gonna be zones where this is a more typical
I
behavior.
mean, we don't have an idea of that though. I hope so, and I believe
Yeah, but you
that's
gotta
how the
look at
game
the
will
design
be.
choice. Yeah, the design choice.
I'm not convinced that SEM will increase the opportunity for heavier ships to get away. I'm not convinced that
But they can't get away anyway.
No, I agree with you on that for sure. I'm just saying I'm not convinced that it will give you that opportunity now, simply based on the fact that probably they're going to make heavy ships have a lower top speed, and your capacitor for boost is only that long, and also give some ballistic weapons, and suddenly you don't have to have all your energy into power. So I'm just not convinced it'll do that, but
it's going to make them fight back better. Fighting a ship, like fighting a hammerhead or a cutlass, or sorry, not a cutlass, a constellation at lower top speeds is more difficult for fighters, because there's more opportunity for the turrets to reach a targeting solution and apply damage. Right? Now,
sure.
if they tune the weapon velocities so that you have to get within a corresponding velocity to be in danger, now we're in luck. Because if you have the maximum weapon range of a fighter pushed to 1,000 instead of 1,400, and you have the maximum range of a turreted ship, like a bigger ship, because it has a bigger power core, 1,400, the velocity can stay the same, but the danger for the light fighter could still be there in some senses, right? So
here's a question, right? Would you, if you were designing Star Citizen, would you use the SEM top speed as a way of balancing the game? Before you answer, in my mind, I feel like all ships should have the same SEM top speed.
okay, so that's an interesting question. And I've thought this before as well, but we're not solving the main issue here, right? So, first of all, would I implement an SCM top speed? I mean, we've always had a top speed. Whether that top speed is at 1,200 or that top speed is at 500, it makes no difference. The fundamental problem is the same, right? You know, the geometry of that just plays out at higher speeds and at different locations, but the problem is still the same, right? So then the answer is, okay, well, what if we just go all standard? Everyone has 500, and it's only limited by the amount of power that you saved up, that you can be in these extended states and all that stuff, right? Well, right, that can be an option, right? But the issue is, if you have a world where you have the larger ships indefinitely able to disengage, we're going to have what's called a stale game, where nobody is going to really be able to play, right? And if you lock it to that, you know, only people that can, because the person that's not shooting at all and is just boosting and recharging boost is always going to be the one to dictate range, because they're going to have the most boost, and that's the most precious resource. So you're going to have to find these interesting ways to tune ships so that, you know, some ships just, you know, that typically want to run more, maybe have less boost, because they're going to spend more time in boost trying to run and all that stuff. But again, it doesn't solve the issue, right? Some ships are going to be able to engage others, period, right? So if you're in a large vessel like a Cutlass, a Hercules, right? You're going to get engaged by smaller stuff, period. Because you need to be engaged by smaller stuff. Otherwise, why would you bring smaller things? It's a tool for the job, right? Bigger stuff shouldn't be threatened by small stuff to some degree, right? A gang of light fighters against a heavily armored Idris, probably not really that big of a threat. But an Idris versus a gang of size 9 torpedoing heavy bombers, well, that's a different story, right? So then you need the smaller things to chase down those other things. So it's an ecosystem, right? So if you lock everything to monotone, right, then that ecosystem can't play out. Then what'll happen is the ship that performs the best at that speed will become the meta ship, and everyone will fly that ship, because why would you fly anything else? There's no dynamics.
So this is gonna be sitting up in the air for a long time because it's gonna take a long time for them to balance these ships, especially when you're bringing in the resource management into the equation.
I don't think so. It doesn't have to take that long. They just
Why
need
not?
to have a clear decision on where. Like I made a video called the balance triangle, right? Where they talk about ships having different roles, right? Now, if those roles correspond to the things they're doing, the speeds will go along with them, right? For example, if you're a light fighter swarm, you should have the biggest opportunity to engage and disengage because that's your specialty, right? But you should not be able to kill big stuff because you are the engage disengage tool, right? Now, if you are a bomber, you should not be able to engage disengage light fighters because that's what kills you. It's an ecosystem, but then you kill the bigger things. The bigger things aren't threatened by the smaller things. Like a school of I use a deep sea reference for this all the time. Like what's threatening to a great white shark?
Humans.
Well, other than humans, humans would be devs in this case, right? They can hit it with the harpoon and Nerf spear, right? But in nature, we have the great white shark. Well, what's its natural predator?
I don't know, an orca.
Okay, that's actually that's true. This is natural predator.
I don't actually know.
I guess the orca would be the point is, sharks are your light fighters, right? But everything has a predator and a prey, right? It has a cycle, right?
Yeah.
Unless you get to the apex predator status, which would be, Bengal carriers and all that stuff. And the only way to take those things down is, get them with just an overwhelming amount of stuff, right? But in the perfect world, there's checks and balances. Fighters in a class of fighters, because you can have individual balancing for the fighters, but as a class, they're good against, small minicap, like small multi-crew ships, and haulers, traders, obviously, because they're not even combat ships, right? That's a different balance triangle, right? And people need to understand the difference between combat military application weapon systems and trading platforms. Just because you have a gun on your ship, which in the lore is legal because you can't certify a ship unless it has a gun, you need to understand that those are not combat ships. A fucking freighter on the high seas is not going to be capable of defending itself against the USS Enterprise. It's just not in the same class. One's military, one's freight and transport, right? So why are we arguing? Why isn't my freighter capable of stopping the USS Enterprise? It's like, well, you're framing it wrong in your mind, right? Now, people need to get out of this mindset of I don't want to engage in PvP ever and all that stuff. It's like use a scout, understand basic flight disengage like strategy. Because the geometry is the same. When we get the new flight system, it'll be more important with our power management, and I'll make a video explaining to people and showing people how to properly disengage and how to disengage quickly. But this whole idea of like, oh, if the guy's shooting at you, it's already too late, right? Like when you're receiving damage, like he's already within 1,000 meters, you've already made your mistake, right? If you're in a freighter with lots of money in it, have one guy in an M50 fly the flight path that you're going on and just check it and see if there's guys there. That alone would limit like 90% of the issues.
But going back to the question of balance, I still don't see how this wouldn't take a long time to balance, considering we don't have resource management, we don't have armor, we don't even have this speed limit system. It just seems like there's a lot of other things that are going to have to take into account before they can set the specific speeds for each of these ships outside of combat to make sure that they're balanced correctly so that they can't run too quickly or they can engage in combat too efficiently.
Well, that'll be so. I'll. Oh, damn it! I'm getting ahead of myself. So I will clarify my position on this. When I say the game is quick to balance, it's quick to get the basic outline there, right? Where ships are in their intended roles. Like some ships are faster than others. So, the minutia of stuff, like, this ship should be like 10 meters per second faster. This ship should be a little slower, or this ship's power is way too high. It's hitting too hard. Like that is always going to be a thing. Consistently will be forever balancing. Like we'll never end that.
That's
it'll
fair.
never end.
Yeah.
Right. EVE Online's been going for 20 years and they're constantly adjusting the numbers a little bit, and they're looking, and that's fine. I mean, that's how the ecosystem works. You know what I mean? that'll never go away. As long as CIG maintains like a finger on the pulse and understands like, okay, yeah, this ship is performing a bit too good, and then adjusting it, not too much that it just cuts it right out of the meta entirely. Then there'll always be a quote unquote flavor of the month. You know what I mean? Like, this in this 6-month period, it's like this ship's going to be really popular because it's slightly faster than another one, or it's really cheap in this area or whatever. It's always going to kind of flip flop, right? And I think in a kind of a weird way, it makes the game kind of interesting too, right? I mean, but as long as we don't have a fundamental metric shift where all of a sudden, heavy fighters are the fighter superiority ship, and like, why would you ever use lights? You know what I mean? Or all of a sudden, the Kraken becomes like the only capital ship worth using because of a certain weapon system or whatever, right? Like, we don't want that big of a shift, right? Like, we want some ships to adjust, and that's always going to be a thing. But we want to get the big blocks of balance in the right spots, and I don't think that'll take too long.
I would definitely hope to see that soon. But overall, it sounds like this is something that is going to maybe limit some things, but definitely be a positive change for the experience of the game in terms of fun. Does that sound like something you both agree on here?
Like I said at the beginning, I feel like this is all very heavy combat talk, right? And Star Citizen is more than just combat talk, or than just combat. And coming to Star Citizen and experiencing these high speeds, even in atmosphere, has been amazing. And having a system introduced that will stop my acceleration before I have reached the capacity for my ship to accelerate will feel strange and unfortunate. And if I have a way to escape that by flying a QCM, not talking combat, I will be happy to do that. But it changes a few things, and I can't decide yet whether I'm excited for them.
Need more info. Definitely.
For sure,
it sounds for what you're talking about, because it sounds like you are very much waiting for them to just confirm that you can maintain a certain style of flying in a certain mode, and we just don't have the info to answer that yet.
I'm waiting for the Star Citizen Life I hope we'll get.
Yeah. We're going to need it on a few different things from citizencon.
I was going to say that earlier, Space. You mentioned this year's citizencon, and it was a different one, right? It was definitely a little smaller. We knew that was going to happen, and that's okay. No problem with that. But I do feel that SEM QCM master modes was introduced with probably too little information. It would have been nice to see some more use cases, some more examples. And we got some B-roll, but it didn't really show anything. And it did leave us hanging with a lot of questions. And I'm not sure, maybe that's their intention. We don't know. But I would have loved to see, for a citizencon, a little bit more in depth. So yeah, if there's anything I can say, is that.
Cool. And Avenger, you obviously, you're liking what you're seeing.
I'm hopeful, and I understand why people are a little bit scared. I get it. I hear you. I think ultimately it is, because I don't want to make this sound like I'm so egotistical. I play the game every day for 8 hours a day. I mean, my life is this game. I love it to death. I know a lot about the flight model. And for me, on a fundamental level, I look at the problems that this new system can fix mechanically in terms of how it's designed, and I'm very much in favor for it, right? Again, I don't know what the specific tuning for some ships will be, and I'm sure they're subject to change so that they're, but overall, like the devs and the guys that are working on this, they're pushing for it to get to a state where you can feel like you're going too fast in a fight, so you have to manage your throttle. It's I was gonna put up another finger, but that would be a little inappropriate. But it's a good system that fixes most of the issues, and I think people, when they get their hands on it, they'll start to understand it. Because it's one thing to have the knowledge. I always say there's a difference between knowledge and understanding. It's like knowledge is you have the paper, you understand in terms of like what you've read, you can see the theory. But understanding is feeling it. You know what I mean? Like getting your hands on it, flying the ship itself, and then getting your time in the seat to really like feel from the ship and get that muscle memory where you start to see it in your mind as well, and the knowledge and the understanding come together, and that's when I think people are going to realize like, okay, I see what Avenger was saying.
Avenger, you keep saying it'll fix so many things, and I just want to say for combat, right? Like,
But, okay,
we're
so what would it not
forcing-
what would it not fix though for other than combat? Like what's the big issue here?
I've been rambling on about the
speeds, right? In terms
ramifications,
of,
but what I wanted to add is it's no problem. Fix all these problems with combat. I see no concern with it, but I think the area for opportunity for me would be to see not everybody that is flying normally, not participating in combat, getting forced into the mode that limits people doing combat. Now, I understand you can be on the receiving end, right? So you got to find a way to balance that. Totally get it. But you can find other ways to do that. I'm sure, having no shields or whatever lore you want to introduce. Just thinking out of the box, right? How could you offer a pilot unrestricted quote unquote speeds as we have them now, with boost and no changes, but without it breaking combat or being on the receiving end of an aggressor? I see opportunity there. You can think about weapons and shields and their countermeasures, right? There is opportunity. In my video, I mentioned PCM, performance control mode. Hell, if it was up to me, I would happily tune my ship and take out the SEM component and put in a PCM one, which makes me, for whatever reason, extremely fragile to an aggressor, so long as it means that I can experience what I have been experiencing. And I don't have the answers. I certainly don't. And yeah, I guess my only concern is that, yes, it fixes a lot of problems, and there's no problem with that. But why is it that the standard mode is the thing that has to fix it? Is there no other way to isolate it a little more?
can I answer that? I know we're short
by
on
all
time.
means, please, of course. Or if it's up to me anyway.
Yeah, go ahead.
I hear you. I do, and standard control tuning makes me think that if there's a standard, why can't that standard not shift, right? They did say that we're going to be able to adjust our IFCS and all that stuff, right? I don't see why in the future we couldn't move to essentially a racing mode where you can tune your standard control mode to a performance control mode, and you dump all your power, shields, guns, everything into your engines and thrusters, and all that stuff. Even take away some from your quantum drive. Who knows? Those spool up times would be longer, but you just dump it all into your power, right? I'm not just a combat guy either. A lot of guys put me in the pigeonhole, and they say like, oh, combat's only Avenger cares about. No, I care about a healthy game that has nuance to it, that has people able to experience the game in all those different avenues, right? There are some choices that we have to make when it comes to the overall flight model to allow for combat dynamics to happen. Because if the current system stays the way it is, combat dynamics are a little bit monotone, right? And there's some issues and at a fundamental mechanical level, right? One being the top speeds, like we talked about before, right? But the game feels fun at those high speeds. I like flying low on Daymar and other places and diving in between the canyons at 800 meters per second. It's cool, you know what I mean? So I'm on board. I hear you. You know what I mean? And again, that is just a tuning thing. That's just a tuning thing. That's not a mechanic thing. You know what I mean? Why can't we have an SCM that tops out around 400, right? And if we go into, again, if we're racing, like we don't have to be in standard control mode, right? We can be in QCM, right? We can be in that higher speed mode, and as long as they tune the different cooldown timers and that kind of stuff, then it's going to be a lot of fun. Because what you don't want is what we have right now, where we have M50s and racing fighters, outperforming dedicated dogfighters and all that stuff. Because then, like, we just reach a game where it's like there's no roles for any ships. There will be one ship to rule them all, basically, right? So I hear you, man. I really do. I really want to see these different modes. I want to see more information on what they have. I want to see the tuning. I want to see the metrics they've used. I want to see the G-forces they've put out, and I want to see if it feels good. I think from a mechanical understanding of how much I've played the game and all the different patches and all the things I've experienced with the game and all the development that they've done, I really do believe that mechanically it's sound. And it just comes down to a tuning decision to make sure that we have the really fast speeds and the really exciting racing that we're looking for, so that, like, because I want to race too. I mean, I would like to race in tournaments. I'll put the time in. Like, I want to race. You know what I mean? So I don't want to see that part of the game just become, like you're driving. You went from driving F1 cars to driving go-karts, right? I don't want to see that to be the case either. And I don't think that this system is going to force that. You know what I mean? I really do think that if they do it right and they tune it right, that we're going to have those speeds, right? But I mean, it all comes down to getting our hands on it and finding out whether that's true or not.
Yeah, we'll have to see. And I think the big thing here is again, as usually is, communication, and hopefully getting some more info on it so we can understand it better. But I'd like to thank you both for coming down for a nice little extended talk about these changes. And I know we didn't touch on everything. I personally would much rather talk about Quantum Boost, but I think this is a much more important topic to tackle, especially from the two different angles you guys are coming from. So thank you so much for joining me for this episode. And before we head out, if you could please let people know where they can find more of your content. Blackmaze, if you'd start.
Yeah, for sure. Just type in Blackmaze on YouTube and you'll find me rambling about Star Citizen flight experiences and XGR racing right there. And if you want to do racing yourself, or you're a fan of racing, you just type in racexgr.com. You'll find our community there on Discord, and you are more than welcome to come hang out with us. We also have a racing school now that is instructed by Shaq New. So if you are looking to improve your decoupled flight or whatever else, come and join us. It is open to everybody.
Well, sorry, yeah, morning. You can find me at Avenger1 on YouTube and Avenger__1 on Twitch. Come join the Discord. Learn as much as you can when it comes to combat, and we go by the mantra of 1% better every day, right? Just get in the cockpit. Don't give yourself this impossible goal. Just be consistent. Do it every day, just a little bit, and watch those incremental improvements add up. And over time, you'll be with the best of them in a shorter time than you might realize.
Cool. Well, thank you both for coming on. If you enjoyed this podcast, anybody who's watching or listening on YouTube or any podcast platform, feel free to maybe subscribe. Check it out. It's every week we bring on different guests and we talk about different subjects surrounding Star Citizen and other sci-fi games. So if you like that, please consider signing up and leaving a review. And if you want to support it, Patreon is a great way to keep us doing what we're doing. Both me and my wife put all of our time into this, so it is appreciated, anybody who helps us keep it going. But besides that, I've got a stream to get to. So thanks again, guys, for coming on and joining this show. Thanks to our supporters for listening live. And thanks to all of you for watching wherever you are. I'll see you all next week.